I told you, there's a lot more to your dog's happiness than good food, cozy shelter, and daily walks. What if we've actually been missing something very crucial? So today we are diving into a great study that reveals exactly what our dogs really need for a generally fulfilling life. Hi, I'm Dr. Annika Bremhorst, a behavioral biologist, canine scientist, and founder of Dogs and Science, dedicated to bridge the gap between cutting-edge research and practical advice for dog lovers everywhere. So in a recent study, research scientist Dr. Karen Griffin and her team, they tackled exactly this question. So they were inspired by the famous Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, and they set out to develop a similar science-based model, one that specifically addresses dogs. Dr. Griffin, whose expertise spans psychology, sociology, and animal welfare, she uniquely focuses on understanding dogs in very challenging life conditions and transitions like rehoming and adapting to shelters. And she knows firsthand how critical it is to support dogs beyond their basic needs.
So I'm Karen Griffin. I'm a research scientist. I study shelter dogs, dog rehoming, relinquishment, anything to kind of do with a dog that's not in a permanent home, but still sometimes I study them. So I'm really focused on dog welfare in terms of the sheltering and rehoming. What are the ways that organizations can improve what they do to ultimately positively affect dogs' welfare? And then also, once a dog gets into a home, what does a successful placement look like in terms of a few things, in terms of relinquishment, what causes relationships to break down, what causes dogs to be relinquished. So yeah, that's what I study.
Yeah, you did this amazing study that I really loved and loved reading. So, what inspired you to do the study?
Years ago, when I was kind of finishing my PhD research, I during my work I had looked at relinquishment and also placing a dog into a home, and what do organizations, when they're going to place a dog and they're going to screen adopters and they're going to screen the dogs, what are they looking for, what factors are they looking for? And so I realized that a lot of organizations have very strict criteria. So in order for someone to adopt a dog, they have to have a particular garden size, or they can't live in a flat, or they can't be away from home for so many hours a day. And it seemed like, some things were being taken into consideration, like safety risks. For example, children in the home are a big issue for a lot of organizations. There's some scientific evidence to support that concern. But it seemed like a lot of what they were doing were based on concerns around a dog's welfare and their well-being once they got into a new home. But there was no research to support these decisions that they were making. And so it seemed like organizations were potentially turning away a lot of really good homes because they didn't have this criteria that actually seemed to be quite arbitrary. It kind of sounded good that adopters need to have a 6-foot garden fence, but we don't actually know how that relates to welfare. But we also know kind of in science that it's possible that there are relationships between certain factors and a dog's well-being, and we just haven't investigated them. And so I kind of said I've wrapped up my PhD and kind of was moving on, and I said we need to look at the quality of life of dogs pre and post adoption. We need to see what's affecting these things. And there has been some research that's looked at the quality of life, the welfare of dogs when they're in a shelter environment. So there's not a lot, but there is some. It mostly focuses on things like how big does a kennel need to be, how often does dog need to go out for exercise, etc. These are definitely all important things. But we also know that a lot of dogs, for example, in a lot of smaller rescue organizations, aren't in a kennel environment. They're in a foster home, either as one dog or with lots of dogs. So they're in other settings. So there was no research that had looked into their well-being in those settings. And then there was no research that had looked into their well-being when they get into a new home. It's not to say that there isn't a study or two that snuck by, but as of a few years ago, there was one study that I could find that looked at welfare in a home. And it was totally a different population than what we were looking at. So my background many, many years ago is in the social sciences. It's in psychology and sociology. So I knew Maslow very well. Um, and I kind of started to think, like, what if we can assess welfare differently? I mean, there are different welfare assessments for dogs, there, for animals. There's the five freedoms, and various other things. And those were a starting point, but I felt like they didn't quite encapsulate what we were getting at. And one of the things that underpins all of my work as a researcher is how can we use scientific evidence how can we apply it to the real world? So we said, okay, the first thing we need to do is we need to adapt the hierarchy. And so how are we going to do it? We are not the first people to adapt Maslow's hierarchy. However, we are the first people to do it in a scientifically sound and robust manner. So that's kind of how we ended up there. And we said, okay, once we adapt it, then we can use this model that we're creating to then assess dogs in homes, and assess them pre-adoption as well. And also, whilst the purpose of this research was looking at sheltering and rehoming, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in a minute, but the idea is that the theoretical model, the hierarchy, could be used to assess the welfare of any dog. So, we're talking about kind of like Western model of dog ownership. But, there are many parts of the world where it's a very different model. So, you have street dogs, you have community-owned dogs. So yeah, and theoretically, we said this model can be used for assessing any dogs.
So how did you then kind of do it? What was your approach in order to adapt kind of the human-oriented hierarchy to dogs?
We said, okay, we need experts' opinion. So we used a method that I've used before in some of my work, that's consensus building. So can we use a panel of experts in the field? So we had people like other canine scientists. I think we had some vets. We did have some people that were working in sheltering for a while, but mostly scientists. And we said, okay, this is kind of what we're doing. This is where we started, and we need your input on how we're adapting it. And it's this iterative method that involves coming together, like, can we agree on how we're adapting it? So we took Maslow and we said, okay, we want to keep this as close to the original as possible. So let's have like a first go at it. So Maslow's hierarchy has 5 levels, and let's see what that looks like for a dog. So we had a first go, and we said, okay, this is what we think, like, these are the needs that fall into each level. Let's just send it off. And they came back, and some bits are like, yeah, that's great. And other bits are like, no, this is not right at all. This is what we do. So when we send it to them, we say, do you agree? And if you don't agree, what are your recommendations for change? And the idea is, through this process, I think we did 3 rounds of it, is to get as close to a consensus as possible amongst the panel of experts.
Could you please tell us about your results? So an overview of, the 5 levels you ended up with together kind of with the experts.
It is very similar to Maslow. So at the bottom, you have physiological needs. So things like access to food and water. And then you kind of go up from there. So then you have safety needs, which focus on things that a dog needs to feel safe. The 3rd level up are social needs. We do distinguish those very carefully. So does a dog have access to other dogs to have social contact with? And do they have sufficient contact with people? The 4th level of it is integrity needs. So it focuses on training and behavioral support. Are dogs receiving positive reinforcement-based behavioral support and training, both for behavioral kind of things for modification, but also just for their general well-being? And then the very top pertains to cognitive needs. So are we giving our dogs all that they need to kind of push and stretch their brains? So one thing that is very unique about this is, we know that most people should know that their dog needs food or water, and if they don't, they've seriously missed something. But we think that a lot of people aren't thinking about the nuances. So one of the examples that I use all the time is, if you have a large older dog and their water bowl is on the floor and they're arthritic, is it painful for them to reach their water bowl? We focus on accessibility. Like they need to have water, but also they need to be able to reach it easily. It needs to be readily available. Is the water clean? Is the bowl clean? So these might seem like things that are taken for granted and obvious, but we think that people are missing some really small nuances. So even just to like get people's brains thinking, to kind of reflect on their own dog's life or the dogs that they're caring for. One really important piece is, you know, we know everyone knows dogs have needs, but there's this issue of anthropomorphizing. So, in case anyone doesn't know, it's basically projecting human emotions, states of mind, motivations, etc., onto non-humans. And in some cases, this is actually really helpful. It helps with empathy. It can sometimes help with, understanding and whatnot. But we also know that humans, it can go the other way, to where we look at dogs so much through our own eyes as humans that we miss out on, if not their needs, then how they need their needs, how they should have their needs met. So, for example, a very nervous and scared dog, first of all, can be hard to identify. They're usually really subtle kind of behavioral things. Um, but even if you know, and there's been some research to support this, even if you know that a dog is scared and nervous, as a human, if you're scared and nervous, you might want like a hug from another human or close contact with another person. A dog does not want that. They do not want to be hugged or embraced or really close. They usually just want their space and someplace to feel comfortable and safe. And so we need to realize that whilst dogs can have similar emotional states, they need those needs met very differently. So that was something that really kind of underpin the work. And so we hope that using the hierarchy, people can kind of start to see differences in needs. Now, the hierarchy focuses on dogs' needs and not how they're met. So we're not saying to give your dog cognitive enrichment, you must use a Kong and this and that. We're not saying that. We're saying that there are loads of different ways to do it, but we just need to have them met. So in terms of how we're practically applying that, we now have adapted the model into an assessment tool, which we're going to be using, again, to assess dogs pre and post adoption. And right now it's at the very kind of scientific stage, which means lots of validation needs to be done. So it's using questionnaires, it's using like visual and video assessments and whatnot. And the idea is that once we kind of validate it, we'll be able to create a tool that just kind of the general public can use to see if they're, if a shelter, if the dogs they have, if their dog's needs are being met. And then similarly, owners. The kind of really big piece is one of the things we're looking at is there a relationship between a dog's quality of life in their new home and whether or not there are these specific characteristics. So are dogs more likely to have a higher quality of life if they have a garden or if they don't live in a flat? Because our plan is that if that's the case, that dogs don't need these characteristics, that we can then turn back to organizations and say, hey, you're turning away some really good homes.
How would it look like? So is it some kind of questionnaire that people fill in, or is it even an app that people can use? Is it something that people do on a daily basis, or do you already have an idea in mind how this could look like?
So right now it's in the shape of 2 questionnaires and these like video clips and video calls. That's obviously unrealistic to use as a tool. But these we use to validate. So to make sure that what the information is being given via like owner completed questionnaires or shelter completed questionnaires is the same as what we're seeing. So if that is the case, if there is that matchup, then we know that the questionnaires work. So yes, in answer to your question, ultimately it will be a questionnaire. One of the things that we're doing, and so we need very, very large samples of dogs, is we're looking at it longitudinally, so over time. So we're thinking, okay, a dog gets placed into a new home. What is their a week out? What is their quality of life look like? How well are their needs being met? But we also know that dog owner relationship, it's dynamic, it changes. So what does that look like over time? A study has found that dogs remain at an increased risk of relinquishment for the first year post acquisition. So the risk is really high right after the dog goes home, and it decreases. But once we get to a year, we know that the relationship is pretty stable, that the dog is likely to stay in the home. Um, so for the work, we're looking at 3 different points post-adoption. So we're looking in the first 2 weeks, we're looking at the 3 to 6 month range, and then we're looking at a year out, to see, is there consistency? Or, because it could be possible that actually dogs' needs are met really well initially because there's novelty, a dog coming home, etc. And then 6 months later, the novelty kind of wears off. People get tired, life gets in the way, are still being met. On the flip side, it's possible that maybe their needs aren't being met as well initially because they don't know the dog very well. And once they get to know the dog better, they can do a better job of meeting their needs. So similarly, in terms of pre-adoption, we're looking at a couple of times. Some dogs are in a shelter for a week, some dogs are in a shelter for 2 years. We know that dogs remain, and this is kind of a big issue, and I think that underpin the work. We know that dogs remain in shelters in some cases for very long periods of time. There's increasing interest and popularity in kind of no-kill movements. So in the US, you have organizations, you have cities that are what they call no-kill. So the idea is that dogs are only euthanized for very specific health and behavioral reasons. You actually have in other parts of the world entire countries that are no-kill. So the idea is noble, but the problem is you end up with dogs staying in environments that are not a home environment for sometimes the better portion of their lives. And if we're thinking about a dog's welfare, we know research has found that in most cases, a dog that's in a home will do better, has better quality of life than a dog that's in a shelter environment. So if our focus is the dog's welfare, are we making the right choices by potentially keeping them in these environments for very long periods of time? So to that kind of point, we're looking at dogs. We're going to do it probably twice pre-adoption. So once when they first come in, and then depending on how long they kind of stick around before being adopted out, then we'll do it again, I think about a month later. So to see how, again, if there's that stability in the length of time, there's potential for dogs' welfare to deteriorate again. So from being in that environment for a long time. So this will help us kind of gauge and will help organizations guide what they're doing. Organizations have really limited resources. So how can they use those resources most effectively to make sure these dogs' needs are being met?
If there's one thing, one message people should remember from this study, what do you think it is?
We want a lot from our dogs. And I don't mean, asking them to do certain tricks or what have you, but we're asking them to fit into our lives. So it's really important that we recognize that whilst there is a lot of overlap, because dogs have evolved with us, and there is a lot of overlap in their needs, we need to be aware that they're a different species. And that even if there is overlap in their needs and our needs, which there is, that sometimes those needs aren't met in the same way. And to be very mindful of that. And that also their needs and how their needs are met can change over time. So, very social puppies, once they get older, actually maybe don't want as many dogs around.
Very wise words, really. And I would like to end with the last question, which is, why do you love dogs and why do you love and do science?
I don't know if it's ironic or whatever. I didn't grow up with dogs. I grew up with cats. I liked our cats, but I was never like an animal person. I never wanted to be a vet. I never wanted to do anything like that. I didn't want to work in a zoo. I was studying the social sciences, and then life happened. I got my first dog in my 20s, so many years ago now. And my first dog, it just sort of changed my life. And I guess I started to think, I hadn't studied them, I didn't know anything about them, I would do a zillion things differently in retrospect than I did 20 years ago. but they're so extraordinary, and I just feel like we owe them so much. Um, and so, yeah, and I just started to think, how can we do things better? And so that kind of merged with your second part of your question. I love science. I love research. I always like need to understand. So I have so many questions. I used to, when I was a child, like drive my parents crazy because I just always had questions. And so I like investigating things. And I guess I just kind of like brought the two together. And that still like evolved over time. My very, very, very first research, long before I did my PhD, I was finishing actually a master's degree in psychology, was looking at psychiatric service dogs. And that kind of segued into everything else. So now I focus, on the dogs. So I just felt like we owed dogs a lot. And how can we make sure that we're doing the right thing for them?
So Karen's research is really an important reminder. So dogs are amazing at adapting to our busy human lives, and now it's our turn to use this growing scientific knowledge to elevate their lives and to really be able to address their needs. And by reflecting those deeper canine needs, we can provide not just safety to our dogs, but a truly fulfilling life for every individual. So do you want to learn more? Check out the full study linked in the description below, along with our detailed Dogs and Science article where we featured exactly this study and the accompanying tool that we developed in order to support you in applying the framework of needs to your own dog's life. So if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more science-based insights and videos in the future. And please share your experiences in the comments below. So we would really love to hear how you're meeting your dog's deeper needs. So stay curious for the love of dogs and science. Thank you. Bye.